Okay. So, all right. Yes. Oh, I forgot one last thing. I got to share my screen. Okay, hold on. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Great. All right. So today we are talking about part 2 of the question, could Jesus have had alliances with Roman and Jewish leaders? And last session, we talked about what Jesus's relationship and Jesus and James might have been with the family of Annas and Caiaphas, and exploring. In this case, actually, last time it wasn't about an alliance. Actually, it was about the opposite, about a feud between the house of Annas and Caiaphas versus the house of Jesus and James. And so this time we're talking about we're going to talk specifically on the Roman side. We're going to look at the Roman side today, not so much the Jewish side. And ask the question, could Jesus have had any alliances with any of the Roman leaders in the time? And this meetup here is based heavily on the work of Barry Wilson and Simca Jacobovici from their book, The Lost Gospel, as well as they have in addition with James Tabor, they created a PBS documentary. And I actually just discovered, I've known about the book for a while, but I just discovered the PBS documentary. Have you guys heard about it? Yeah, it's real cool. It's really good. I recommend that. And basically the ideas in this meetup come heavily from them. And I just discovered, so not only do they have a book about this, but they also have a PBS documentary that you can also get on like the Apple Store too. And so it's really good. So today we're particularly looking at what the relationship was with Jesus and some of the Roman leaders. So last time in our last minute we talked about the high priests, Caiaphas and Annas, and the high priests in the Jerusalem temple during the time of Jesus. And now what we're looking at here is we're going to talk a lot about the Roman side here, particularly Tiberius and Sejanus and Pontius Pilate. So these are like the three big guys that we'll be focusing a lot on today. Tiberius was the Roman emperor. Sejanus was actually technically not a Roman emperor, but in a sense he was sort of. He was very close because Tiberius withdrew from Rome because he wasn't really that interested in ruling, and instead more interested in having these sexual exploitations on his fantasy island of Capri. And apparently one of the ancient historians says that this is basically, he had this island where basically probably even young children or children were there around, and he would just kind of go exploring with them. So yeah, it's pretty crazy stuff. In the meantime, Sejanus was back in Rome, and so Sejanus actually has been often is not talked about because he never technically was emperor. Yet during the end of Jesus's lifetime, the argument is made that Sejanus was in fact the de facto emperor at this time, because Tiberius was absent. And in fact, actually, Sejanus appointed Pontius Pilate. And so we're going to get into that. Also, too, we're going to talk a little bit about Valerius Gratus, who was the governor of Judea before Pontius Pilate. And so he had this position, and Valerius Gratus was the one responsible. He made a whole bunch of changes to the high priesthood in Jerusalem. So basically a lot of these changes in positions to the high priesthood in Jerusalem were responsible or were enacted by Valerius Gratus, who was there. Meanwhile, in Galilee, Herod Antipas is ruling in Galilee around this whole time. And in fact, actually, we're going to talk about Herod Antipas in our next meetup. So in other words, so last meetup was about the high priests. This one today is going to be about the Roman rulers, and then our next one we're going to talk a lot about Herod Antipas here. But so all right, now coming over to the Tiberius and the family tree. It's very, as we talked about in our last meetup too, the family trees of these emperors is very convoluted because there's lots of adoption and then multiple wives. So children with different wives, then adopting cousins and all that. So it's lots of crisscross line. It's very confusing. Basically, Augustus was the first Roman emperor, and who was the adopted son of Julius Caesar, not even his formal son, but the adopted son. Augustus had several wives, but and then through the Tiberius became his adopted son. So Tiberius wasn't even his blood son, but he was his adopted son. So Tiberius is Augustus's adopted son. Now, during Tiberius's reign, while he was emperor, there were two guys in line to succeed Tiberius. Very important. One was Drusus the Younger, and this was Tiberius's blood son. And the other one was Germanicus, and this was his adopted son. So there were two Roman emperors, or two people in line for being Roman emperors after Tiberius, and these are the two guys, Drusus the Younger and Germanicus. They both died or were killed before Tiberius died. So instead, the next one went to Caligula. And so Caligula was actually younger than Claudius, but so Caligula became emperor first and then Claudius. So that's also kind of a weird thing. So Caligula, the younger became emperor, and then Claudius, the older, became the fourth emperor. So it goes Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius. All right. Now, okay, so we will take turns reading as normal. So Eric, can you see that?
Yes.
Do you see the box in front of the presentation too? Do I need to minimize that? Of the people, your face?
Oh, well, I minimized it myself a little bit, so.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah,
so
go ahead.
Okay, so Emperor Tiberius. Tiberius was one of the greatest Roman generals. His conquest of Pannonia, Dalmatia, Raetia, and temporarily parts of Germania laid the foundations for the northern frontier. Even so, he came to be remembered as a dark, reclusive, and somber ruler who never really desired to be emperor. Pliny the Elder called him the gloomiest of men. After the death of his son Drusus Julius Caesar in AD 23, Tiberius became more reclusive and aloof. In 26 AD, he removed himself from Rome and left administration largely in the hands of his unscrupulous praetorian prefects Lucius Aelius Sejanus and Quintus Naevius Sertorius Macro. When Tiberius died, he was succeeded by his grandnephew and adopted son, Caligula.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, thanks. So basically, again, just as we already stated, like during the end of Jesus's lifetime, Tiberius was technically the emperor, but everything was being routed through Sejanus, and not through, because Sejanus was in Rome managing all the affairs, and he was basically Tiberius's man. Actually, something that I don't include in the slide, so I'll mention this right now, is that Sejanus started off as just like kind of like a bodyguard, and not really of all that power necessarily. But there is a story that when Tiberius and Sejanus and other people were dining in another island or on the coast of Italy, that there was a landslide and Sejanus dove over Tiberius to protect him. And at that point, that impressed Tiberius so much that he called Sejanus his right-hand man from there on. And that was a big milestone in Sejanus amassing massive amounts of power. So then when Tiberius was outside of Rome, everything that Tiberius, all communication through Tiberius was going through Sejanus. So I mean, Sejanus had incredible amounts of power and trust, and he was basically Tiberius's main guy for a time. Okay, now Germanicus, Devin.
Okay, Germanicus, very popular son of Tiberius. Many thought he was going to be the next emperor. In fact, his troops even declared him an emperor before Tiberius died. Germanicus was put into difficult situations by Tiberius, and Germanicus passed by Galilee several times. In AD 17, he returned to Rome, where he received a triumph before leaving to reorganize the provinces of Asia Minor, whereby he incorporated the provinces of Cappadocia and Campania in AD 18. While in their eastern provinces, he came into conflict with the governor of Syria, Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso. During that feud, Germanicus became ill in Antioch, where he died in the 10th of October, AD 19. His death was attributed to poison by ancient sources, but that was never proven. As a famous general, he was widely popular and regarded as the ideal Roman long after his death. To the Roman people, Germanicus was the Roman equivalent of Alexander the Great due to the nature of his death at a young age, his virtuous character, his dashing physique, and his military renown.
Yeah. So Germanicus was very popular, and he was slated to be the next emperor. All that changed when he may have died by natural causes or may have been killed. Drusus the Younger. Okay, so Drusus the Younger was the son of Emperor Tiberius and heir to the Roman Empire following the death of his adopted brother Germanicus in AD 19. His political career mirrored that of Germanicus, and he assumed all his offices at the same age as him. Following the model of Augustus, it was intended that the two would rule together. They were both popular, and many dictations have been found in their honor across Roman Italy. Cassius Dio calls him Castor in his Roman history, likening Drusus and Germanicus to the twins Castor and Pollux of Roman mythology. Drusus died suddenly on September 14th in year 23, seemingly from natural causes. Ancient historians such as Tacitus and Sejanus claim he died amid a feud with the powerful Sejanus, Praetorian prefect of Rome. They allege that he had been murdered. In their account, Sejanus had seduced his wife Livilla, and with the help of a doctor, she had poisoned Drusus. Despite the rumors, Tiberius did not suspect Sejanus, and the two remained friends until Sejanus's fall from grace in the year 31. Okay, now we're going to get to Sejanus. This is the focus of our discussion today. So, Eric, why don't you go?
Sejanus rose to power as prefect of the Roman imperial bodyguard, known as the Praetorian Guard, of which he was commander from AD 14 until his death in AD 31. While the Praetorian Guard was formally established under Emperor Augustus, Sejanus introduced a number of reforms which saw the unit evolve beyond a mere bodyguard into a powerful and influential branch of the government, involved in public security, civil administration, and ultimately political intercession. Sejanus gradually accumulated power by consolidating his influence over Tiberius and eliminating potential political opponents, including the emperor's son, Drusus Julius Caesar. When Tiberius withdrew to Capri in 26, Sejanus was left in control of the administration of the empire. For a time, the most influential and feared citizen of Rome, Sejanus suddenly fell from power in AD 31. The year his career culminated with the consulship. Amidst suspicions of conspiracy against Tiberius, Sejanus was arrested and executed along with his followers.
Okay, so Sejanus was, for a time between the years 26 and 31, he was the most powerful person in Rome and basically the de facto Roman emperor while Tiberius was absent. However, in October of the year 31, a letter was written to Tiberius, and actually I can't remember now by whom it was, accusing Sejanus of conspiracy and accusing Sejanus of wanting to kill off the competition to be the next Roman emperor. And so Tiberius basically had him arrested and executed instantly, and it was a surprise attack on Sejanus. So Sejanus was Tiberius's right-hand man and trusted man for these 5 years. But then at the very end, it was a very sudden and very dramatic downfall. Sejanus or Tiberius basically had them trick Sejanus into getting into the Senate without his protection. And then in that moment, as they were reading a letter, it was basically Tiberius accused. So Tiberius was still not even there in person. This was all kind of happening remotely. So as this letter of Tiberius was being read and Sejanus was being accused right there, they immediately jumped on him, arrested him, and executed him in kind of like a trick while Sejanus was not protected by his own men. And so his downfall was very drastic, very sudden, and had lots of implications to the empire. All right, now we're gonna look here first at Pontius Pilate. So go ahead, Devin.
All right, Pontius Pilate was an appointee of Sejanus. Pilate acted in ways that offended the religious sensibilities of the Jews. According to Josephus, Pilate's removal from office occurred because he violently suppressed an armed Samaritan movement at Mount Gerizim. According to Wilson and Jacobucci in the Lost Gospel, Sejanus should have appointed both a prefect in Jerusalem and a governor in Antioch, but delayed putting anyone in Antioch, perhaps to make Pilate the de facto governor of both.
Yeah, so one thing that these guys, Barry Wilson and Simca Jacobovici, really kind of talk a lot about, and that I think they raise a really good question, is that who's allied with who? Who's aligned with who? And I think it's a great question, and it's not one that I've asked really before. And so after reading their book, I've also asked myself that question, like, so we know that Pontius Pilate now was aligned with Sejanus because it was Sejanus who appointed Pilate, and I think it's an interesting thing to keep in mind, and we'll explore that more. So basically, real quick about Pontius Pilate, like one thing that we know from history, from a lot of the records, is that he was very offensive to the Jews, and that and throughout his whole career, he would basically do things offending the Jews. And in fact, he was finally removed from office because of the way he reacted against an uprising in Samaria. And so, but the interesting thing about this is that the Gospels, they all paint a picture of Pilate as being hesitant to answer Jesus, or to being hesitant to crucify Jesus. A lot of historians say that this is just totally wrong, that this is totally out of character for Pilate, that there's no way that he would have been lenient to Jesus, that he would have executed him happily, as he always enjoyed offending the Jews, and that this record in the Gospels can't be trusted. It can't be true. And in fact, actually, one other reason why they point to this is because crucifixion itself was a Roman punishment and not a Jewish punishment. If it was just a Jewish punishment, Jesus may have been stoned, but the Roman form of execution was crucifixion. So again, and that kind of emboldens the modern day historians to usually claim that, yeah, this record in the New Testament of Pilate being sensible or being hesitant to crucify Jesus just can't be trusted at all. It just can't be accurate. And so, yeah, let me pause real quick. What do you guys think so far before we kind of get in? We're going to start looking at some texts, but you guys got any comments so far?
No, I'm trying to figure out where it's going with it. Like,
yeah.
So clearly something about Pontius Pilate being on one Roman side versus another.
Yeah.
And the maybe the high priest being on another, and
yeah.
kind of rivals. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So now, yeah, this is about the aftermath of Sejanus's downfall, and maybe before we read this, so basically what Wilson and Jacobovici are kind of suggesting is, like, there were different people in the Roman Empire, not even talking about the Jews yet, but just within the Roman Empire, who kind of were allying themselves with different people. So the like Pontius Pilate would have been allied with Sejanus, but there were other people who may have been allied with Germanicus, and because he was, and the reason why it's a very natural thing, basically in the empire like Rome, is that you kind of always kind of looking to see to the future, and you're trying to play your cards right so that the people who you support get into power, or that you hope the people that, or maybe I should say, even to, if you see someone who's going to be getting into power, you try to get on their good side, and so try to see kind of where to try to take advantage of that relationship. And so so here the kind of like the story that they're painting here, like the backdrop, is that Pontius Pilate was appointed by Sejanus, and maybe even to be de facto ruler of Antioch as well, because apparently Sejanus did not appoint the governor in Antioch at the same time, leaving which kind of left that open for maybe Pontius Pilate to take care of. And so meanwhile, so we have like these guys. The point is that like Pilate then is hoping, he's hoping that Sejanus will become the next emperor. If Sejanus becomes emperor, that's very good for Pilate. It's very good, because it means that that he's like basically his party basically is the one in power. Now, though, there's something that happens though suddenly, very dramatically, and this had to have been a shock to Pilate as well, that when Sejanus fell from power, it was very sudden, it was very drastic, and this must have upset Pilate and disturbed him. So, all right, who read that last one? Pilate. Was that? Did I read that one? Or did Devin, you read that? You read that one maybe?
I think I did.
Okay, so I read this one. The aftermath of Sejanus' downfall. That same evening, the Senate convened at the Temple of Concord and summarily condemned Sejanus to death. Riots ensued, in which crowds hunted and killed anyone they could link to Sejanus. The Praetorians also resorted to looting when they were accused of having conspired with the former prefect. Following the issue of damnatio memoriae by the Senate, his statues were torn down and his name obliterated from all public records. On October 24th, Sejanus' eldest son Strabo was arrested and executed. Upon learning of his death, Apicata committed suicide on October 26th after addressing a letter to Tiberius claiming that Drusus had been poisoned with the complicity of Livilla. Enraged upon learning the truth, Tiberius soon ordered more killings. Livilla committed suicide or was starved to death by her mother Antonia Minor. The remaining children of Sejanus, Capito Alinus and Yahulanilla, were executed in December of that year. In other words, the point is that it was a dangerous time to be associated and affiliated and aligned with Sejanus. People all over were then suddenly now being put into question, because this now it's dangerous. Sejanus was suddenly, he had a tragic sudden downfall, and people associated with Sejanus were also being brought down too. Pilate was one of those people associated with them. So in our last meetup, we asked the question, did James's execution occur at a time of political uncertainty during a change of the guard? Because remember, in our last meetup, we were talking about that, like, it was actually the house of Annas again, and it was actually Annas' son Annas, son of Annas, who suddenly won the high priesthood during the time of political uncertainty in Rome, during a change of guard. He struck James, executed James very quickly, very swiftly, in what was basically judicial murder. It was and all the Jewish, or many of the Jewish people were upset about it. They complained to King Agrippa, and they got Annas, son of Annas, removed from the high priesthood after only 3 months in the position, because they accused him of acting unjustly and basically taking advantage of political uncertainty. So we know that this already happened, or at least that I think it's reasonable to assume that James, the brother of Jesus, was executed during a change of guard during a few decades after Jesus. This stuff happens. And so what in their book, Jacobovici and Wilson, they cite a fellow colleague who's not really that famous. He's not like a famous scholar, but he is a scholar, I believe, in his own right. I think he does work at an institution, or he did teaching classes. He never made it to be a famous scholar, but I really like that they give him credit, even though he's not really a famous scholar. So in his book, Paul Meyer writes that he talking about John 19:12, that he says that there was only one time when Pilate could be threatened, as he was right here, right after Sejanus died, and there was a purge of pro-Sejanus people. So basically in John 19:12, the Jews threatened Pilate. And it says, from then on, Pilate sought to release Jesus. But the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So one suggestion by Paul Meyer here is that this is actually, although it doesn't say specifically, but Paul Meyer suggests that the context of this quote should be understood during the time right when Sejanus was executed, and then suddenly Pilate is feeling very vulnerable, because Pilate was putting all of his cards in the hope that Sejanus was going to be the next emperor. Because if Sejanus would have been the next emperor, that would have been really good for Pilate. Now, all of a sudden, Pilate is in a very sensitive position. He no longer had the person who was protecting him in Rome. And so what we have here, Paul Meyer is suggesting that maybe the Jews were actually aware of this as well and threatening him like that. So we're going to read actually this now right here from John 19. This is the greater context of that. Eric, is it your turn to read?
Yeah, okay. So then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin."
Okay, let's finish this part too. Devin, you want to read this one? This is the next part of it.
From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in the Aramaic Gabbatha. So now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified.
So traditionally amongst historians, modern historians, this whole scene here, they find very problematic because it just does not fit the character of Pilate that is known from other sources. They say that, like, basically here in this reading here, we have Pilate being scared, hesitant, And but all the historical records indicate that Pilate was very aggressive, very ruthless, and violent towards the Jews. So traditionally, by modern historians, they claim that this just can't be historically accurate. This is just totally wrong. For whatever reason, they decided to make Pilate look kind of good. And the reason actually modern historians tend to give to this is they say that early Christians were trying to make themselves look friendly to the Roman Empire and trying to basically not accuse their overlords of any wrongdoing. That's usually how modern historians explain this, explain like why Pilate is portrayed as such a weak person here, is because they're trying to not offend their then modern or their then current Roman overlords. But there is one other possibility, I guess, and I'm open to hearing or open to basically debate or different opinions. But one other possibility is that Pilate, like that Jesus was crucified right, or let me say, Sejanus fell from power. Pilate's supporter in Rome is suddenly not there, and he doesn't want to lose his power. He doesn't want to fall either, and so Pilate, for whatever reason, he has this change of character as well. But in the Jews themselves, when they're trying to get Jesus, or like some of the people in John's story here, some of the people from the crowd, some Jews from the crowd, when they're saying, if you release Jesus, you're not Caesar's friend. That everyone, basically what they're doing here, according to Paul Meyer's interpretation, is that they're threatening Pilate that, look, if you don't crucify him, we're going to basically tell that you're still aligned with Sejanus, that you're against Tiberius. And so because of that, Pilate is very scared. That's his interpretation. What do you guys think?
I think just for the sake of a bit of a trope, so I wouldn't even say like early Christians are necessarily trying to make themselves look good with Roman overlords. I would say it works just as a bit of a nice early trope where you have somebody who's strong, weak in the presence of Jesus in some way.
Yeah.
So same thing, as far as like John the Baptist, right? So I'd say it could just be regular proselytization in terms of like look at these strong figures becoming weak before this other person here. Not necessarily that they're trying to even look good for the Romans, because I'm not even sure it does that. Like it's making a strong leader look weak, and that helps us look better to the Romans. I don't know if that really fits either.
Okay, yeah, I think that it's good to brainstorm ideas. I think that is a valid option. Yeah. What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, I think that could be a possibility. Also, like my thing is, like, why would Pontius, or if someone's claiming to be king of the Jews, right? Why would Pontius Pilate be so lenient anyways then? Like what would be his motive to be like, oh, okay, bro, you can have him back now? I mean, I guess the implication would be that Pontius Pilate spoke with him and he realized that Jesus was not really saying he was going to be like an earthly king, and he saw no threat in that. Therefore, he was like, okay, that you're not really a threat, whatever. And then the chief priests were like, well, wait a minute, he is. Don't let him come back, And then he's like, well, I don't see any real threat. And the chief priests were like, well, we'll tell that you're not doing your job or whatever, and you're aligned with the wrong people, so that might be bad for you. So he's like, okay, yeah. So I mean, that seems to be what the implication is in John, but it also depends on your interpretation. With did Jesus was he more claiming to be an earthly king or a god? In the way the early Christian, or the way the maybe Hellenized version of it was a heavenly kingdom that he's trying to say. And I think it was both. And I think it was threatening to both. So I don't see why Pontius Pilate would have not saw him as a threat anyways. But anyway, I don't know.
And the possibility could be there that even if Pilate thought that he was trying to be a king, he still didn't view him as a threat, because look at all the other Jewish leaders just wanting to kill him.
Right.
Like, what have you organized? You've organized nothing, and still he thinks it's kind of funny.
Right. Maybe
And he exclusively deals with them. They're the mediators with the Jewish people, so he's like, wow, all these other leaders don't think he's anything all that special, and they don't agree with him, then obviously he's not gaining that much of a following here.
Or
We have a revolt happening.
Or one other possibility is that maybe Pilate, maybe Jesus was making a run for the earthly king, as an earthly king, but maybe Pilate was actually okay with that, because Pilate could have thought that he would still be Jesus's overlord anyway, in a similar sense, like a puppet king, that because puppet kings are very common here in the Roman Empire, and maybe it's possible that that for whatever reason, Pilate and Sejanus and even Jesus, possibly, this is just one theory, and I don't know if this is necessarily correct, but just to put it out there, but it's possible that they basically had aligned where they were all getting something out of this. Pilate, or Sejanus was going to be the next emperor. Pilate was going to be maybe then the take over, some other position where he is like the overlord of Judea, with Jesus as his puppet king, and maybe he offered then, or it's possible that Jesus's claim to being the king wasn't even necessarily a direct threat to Pilate. I don't know. Just one possibility. Another reason that like these Jacobo Vinci and James Tabor talk about this stuff is for this next one that we're looking at now too here. Actually, well, there's two things here that we're looking at. Let me come back to this slide. Actually, let me take. Let's see here. Actually, no, okay. Let me talk about this one here right now, and then we'll come back to this other one. And that is, there is another strange thing here about Jesus, about the story that we find in the Gospels. Something that's very strange and also very difficult for historians to explain. And that is like, how did Jesus get away with disrupting the temple? I mean, we're talking about the holy day, the holy festival, one of the most important festivals for all Jews, where they came in from all over the country to Jerusalem during Passover to celebrate this, one of the most important festivals on the Jewish calendar. And yet Jesus is making a ruckus in the Jerusalem temple. And he does so without even being arrested on the spot. How is that possible? Well, actually, Wilson and Jacobo Vinci and James Tabor, they all suggest that, well, maybe Jesus actually had some protection during this time. And so we're going to look at these two verses, or these two passages from Mark. Does anyone know whose turn it is to read? I forgot. I should maybe try to keep better record of that. Eric, do you want to read?
Devin, because I read last. Or no. I don't remember who read.
What was that? I didn't hear you.
If you back up the slides, we'd probably be able to tell pretty quick.
Yeah, this one. Oh, yeah, Devin, I think you read that last one, right? On part 2.
I could read
yep.
too.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so I'll do it here. So we know that even after, so Jesus and James both, well, even after Jesus' crucifixion, we know that James still spent a lot of time in the temple. James was known for actually having calloused knees because he spent so much time in the temple. So the temple was very important to James. And Jesus too apparently had a big scene in the temple, yet he got away with it. And one question is how is this even realistic? Is this even possible? So Mark from chapter 11 says, "And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, 'Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers.' And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. And then later in Mark chapter 14, it was now 2 days before the Passover and the feast of unleavened bread. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. So, first of all, actually, maybe just to kind of establish the context, Eric, do you want to like explain even what the money changers were doing in the temple and why this is even there? Because a lot of people don't really realize that it was kind of a normal part of the Jewish practice of you know what I mean?
You had to change. You couldn't have like idols on the coins, right? Like you couldn't have like Nero's face. You couldn't have emperor's faces on there, I think. And so you had to change it or there's something like that. I don't remember.
Actually, though, from my recollection, what it is like, so people were buying their sacrifices, and people traveled from all over Israel, and they wouldn't necessarily bring in their sacrifices with them. That's just like one more thing for the hard journey. So what they would do, they would just bring some money, and then at the temple they would purchase some whatever, pigeons, animals, lambs, anything to make their sacrifice there during that time.
Like Jewish or pagan temples at the antique and to the late antique times were such vibrant places, like the social, cultural life and economical life. These cultural and economic aspects took places in temples, like both in pagan and Jewish temples. So it's like pretty normal. Even if there wasn't a festival, the money changers or stores would be built near temples.
Hey, Hakan, glad you're here. How long have you been here?
Me too. Like 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, good, really good. Yes, so yeah, that's like the context. And so basically though, so one thing that historians kind of have to deal with then is like, how could Jesus get away with making such a traumatic scene in the temple? Either one, like this is not a true story, that it wasn't really as, or like if Jesus did make a scene, it's exaggerated maybe, and it's not even to this point, or that for some reason that the temple authorities really couldn't or wouldn't arrest him and stop him during the scene. So one thing that James Tabor, Jacobovici, and Barry Wilson suggest is that maybe during this time, Pontius Pilate and the Roman overlords were actually allowing this to happen. That Jesus didn't do anything that he wasn't allowed to do. Interesting idea, I guess. What do you think?
Nice thought. I also think that so in historiography, so the late antique and medieval writers write parts like from I don't know, like Homeros or some antique writers. So like in if we draw a similarity, a pattern right here. So think about the ancient Greek culture. Think about like some an philosopher that which the government or state doesn't really like that much. So he was like annoying the officials in the festival, like annoying people, or I'm making it much simple, but so I would like to say it maybe is some kind of storytelling pattern, like taking from the ancient Greek culture, a life of philosopher, or I don't know. I should look up that.
Yes. Okay, so basically the question that we're looking at here, let's go back to this slide, is did Jesus have any alliances with certain Roman leaders? And to be more specific, the question that we're trying to ask is, could Jesus have allied with powerful families who would have benefited from the removal of Caiaphas's family from the Jerusalem temple? Like, for example, maybe, as we looked at in our last meetup, I think that the evidence is very strong that the house of Annas and Caiaphas had a feud against the house of Jesus and James. I think we can call that a feud, and that, this is really strong. But there may be other powerful families in Jerusalem or around that time who also did not like the house of Annas and Caiaphas. And maybe they would have benefited, and maybe they would have allied themselves with Jesus's run for that. Or were there other powerful families who would have benefited from Jesus becoming the new king or the new high priest? And I know that we typically think about this question only in the context of, like, after 2,000 years of Christianity, we kind of interpret this question as, well, no, obviously Jews would not have wanted Jesus as the new king because that supports Christianity. Or, like, in other words, like that this question, though, it's these days when people ask this question, it's really assuming a lot of religious overtones and assuming a lot of the theological controversy in between Christians and Jews that have happened for the last 2,000 years. But if you could go back and not have that controversy, or you could somehow kind of look at it with fresh eyes without thinking about this theological question about, with Jesus as like the Christian king or high priest or the son of God, but instead think about it like in the context of first century Palestine right here. Like, would Jesus may have had some allies who supported his run for the king, his run for the high priesthood, either way. And then another question too is, like, would there have been some powerful families who have actually even wanted a Jewish uprising against Rome? Maybe if Jesus was maybe a insurrectionist, maybe there were some powerful families who actually supported that, who supported his run exactly just because he wanted a violent uprising against Rome. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe on the other hand, he was allied with Rome too. That's also a possibility. But were there maybe some powerful families who would have benefited from a Roman invasion? And maybe they were kind of hoping that to get the Jews riled up or something. Lots of good questions, I think. I think that these are like really good questions. And then if you try to look at this question without the 2,000 years of theological history and kind of from the context of the theological debate, and kind of look at it as maybe someone might have looked at it during that time, from the perspective of these Jews and Romans, actually, I think there's some pretty good questions here. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, so what would Pontius Pilate get out of Jesus being a puppet king, I guess, and what would Caiaphas get out of him not being a puppet king?
Yeah,
because they wanted him to take over the priestly family, like his lineage, or something like that as well.
Right. Yeah, you know what? I think that I don't have a good answer for that. I really don't. And even in the authors that I'm reading here and that I'm kind of relying on for this meetup here, I'm still not sure that they've provided a really good solution to that, or a really good answer to that question. So I think that conversation is still open. That the question is open. But since you asked, this does relate to the next one right here. So could Caiaphas and Pilate have secretly wanted a Roman invasion? So this is actually suggested by another author, who his name is Chris Seep. And again, I actually give kudos. I think it's really cool. Jacobovici and Barry Wilson, that they even mention these kind of non-scholarly people in their book. To me, I respect that. Because a lot of like fellow biblical scholars will attack them for thinking, oh, you can't cite this, or you can't, don't even mention that because that just makes you look unscholarly. But I think it's really cool. I really respect Jacobovici and Wilson for basically talking about ideas that don't necessarily come from the scholarly community, but may come from Christian fiction. And that's what this is. Chris Seep here is he's writing historical fiction, but yet maybe he's onto something. Hakan, actually, do you want to read this slide?
Of course. Encouraged by Jesus' words, I did not come to bring peace but a sword, to set a man against his father and the daughter, and the daughter against her mother. Pilate secretly wants Jesus to become the Judean people's military leader and incite them into an uprising against Rome. Caiaphas, I'm not sure. Meanwhile, Caiaphas, meanwhile, covertly conspires with others close to Jesus to advance the high priest's own personal agenda by manipulating this Sanhedrin, Judea's high council, and the Romans into executing Jesus, also intending to inflame the Judean people into rebelling against Rome. Why are both men pursuing an international agenda to kindle an uprising against Rome? And why do both men want Jesus dead? What role does Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the most powerful man in the Roman Empire, play this multifaceted conspiracy?
So yeah, again, it's like you have a fiction writer here, and but Jacobovici and Wilson give him props in their book for, hey, at least thinking, like, maybe asking a good question. And they're not necessarily endorsing that, but I think the question though is just really good. And then again, it's like, were there people who could have benefited from Jesus's run for the king or Jesus's run for the high priesthood? Were there people who supported Jesus and his family over Caiaphas and his family? Or were there even people who supported Jesus as becoming the new king? Maybe that would be a king against Rome, or maybe that would be a king allied with Rome as like a puppet king. You can play it in so many different ways. It's actually, I just like this door being open for this kind of question to be asked. Anyone have any good theories to explain it?
So I'm just trying to understand that last slide's theory.
Which one?
So
this one here?
Is Caiaphas supposed to be with Pilate or against Pilate in this?
That's actually a good question. I think, I have to read this too here. Apparently, I think that according to this guy's theory, Chris Seep's theory, is that Jesus is not aligned with Pilate and Jesus is not aligned with Caiaphas. But both Pilate and Caiaphas are actually taking advantage of Jesus's presence and following to incite people to incite the Judean people and rebel against Rome, because they both want a rebellion against Rome. And so I think this is actually a different answer, I think it's different from what we were talking about earlier about maybe if Jesus was aligned with Sejanus and Pilate. This is actually a different approach. In this idea that Chris Seep is saying, no, Jesus was not aligned with Pilate nor Caiaphas, but they were though both taking advantage of this to basically incite the people to rebel against Rome.
Interesting. What would they gain out of a rebellion against Rome?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess if Chris Seep here is right, they were hoping to get people to rebel against Rome. I guess, obviously they're just trying to get more power themselves. But yeah, you're right. I don't know, how would they actually get more power? How would they get more power? How would they rise to higher positions with the Roman invasion necessarily? Yeah, I agree. I'm not too sure about that either. So maybe this idea is kind of weak for that reason. I can't really explain that well.
Yeah, you'd have to give the motive.
Right, yeah, what's the motive? Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, another thing we could be missing here is Jesus could have been a very minor character in Jewish history, and this whole thing might have been a lot more like like we tend to want to, because we're studying him, we want to make it out to be like this was a huge event, and like, I mean, all of Jerusalem was looking on, and everyone was paying attention to this, like it was CNN, and everyone had, like
Yeah.
this could have been such a minor event, and it got, of course, the people that the group that focused on Jesus could make it a major event, but maybe in the overall scheme of things, he was a very minor figure in any respect, whether to the Romans or to the high priests or anybody.
That is a possibility. I agree. That Jesus wasn't even Jesus wasn't even on the radar of Caiaphas or Pilate or any of them, or Sejanus especially, right?
But then you could come back and say, well, that James incident, the fact that Josephus mentions that at all, and that was like it almost seems like a catalyst for the whole rebellion. You could say that really his family might have been more prominent than people, than you would think.
Yeah.
So maybe there is actually evidence that Jesus's family was more, in the mix of politics than people, than you might think otherwise.
Yeah. Well, I do, definitely. There's advocates for both camps. For sure, John Dominic Crossan argues that Jesus was a marginal Jewish peasant, hardly a blip on the radar, and Pontius Pilate was a cruel Roman prefect or governor, basically, and just did not hesitate at all when Jesus, when he heard about this little insignificant rebel leader named Jesus coming up, Pilate was like, off with him, execute him quickly, just as we execute all the others, without a hesitation on it. So that certainly is very, and I think that's kind of more the dominant view within modern scholarship of that. So Jesus, yes, very insignificant. Pontius Pilate not having any hesitation at all to execute him, and Jesus hardly even being a character at all worth worrying about. So that is definitely a possibility. I actually though lean towards kind of like going back to like 2 or 3 meetups ago, where Jesus actually, although he may have started from a humble beginning in Nazareth, that for whatever reason, partly because he was such a good charismatic leader, that he was able to create a very surprising following that included really high level people in his following as well, even before he was executed. That's where I personally lean.
Well, yeah, there may have been definitely.
One thing to just kind of call attention to, I think just because it's good as we're looking at this evidence and all that, is that in the story that we have in John, when Pilate is afraid, it seems that he's afraid of the people. And so actually I don't really remember where I was gonna go with this now. I think we were talking about earlier something bad, but like that, that's also like a force to kind of it's interesting. The people play the role of the people is also very interesting. So we have like how was Jesus aligned with Pilate if he was? How was he aligned with or what was his relationship with Caiaphas? And then the other thing is too, like his relationship with like just the general people in Jerusalem at the time. That's a hard question to answer as well. It seems, according to the Gospels, it seems that initially when he got into Jerusalem, he was aligned with the people. And when he even, actually, I remember now. I was going to say, it's like the people kind of change when when Jesus is kind of disrupting the temple. Actually, where did I have that slide here? When Jesus is disrupting the temple, it seems that the people are protecting Jesus, not even necessarily the Roman soldiers. Oh yeah, this is kind of where I was going to go with this one. Like in the stories with Mark, we have this idea that the people are protecting Jesus, and even though like Jacobovici and Wilson and Tabor, they suggest that it actually had been the Romans, the occupying Romans, who were protecting him, or maybe it was a little bit of both. But at least in Mark here, we have it's that is really like the people that seem to be, and like the chief priests were hesitant to make a move on Jesus because of the people. Maybe it could have been both the people and the Romans do, and maybe like the chief priests felt like they were in the minority in this particular event. But then by the time the crucifixion happens, it seems like it's the people who want him dead, and Pilate who is the one hesitating. So this is actually interesting too. What happened that the people changed, or did the people change? Did the people have one position and then change to another position?
I mean, it could be that one is, well, Mark seems more closer to possibly historical accuracy than John, in that it's earlier and John clearly has an agenda to make Jesus a certain way, where Mark might have a less of an agenda like that. That's a possibility.
So I'll tell you one other thing too, real quick, that Tabor and Jacobovici and Wilson suggest is that some of the timeline has been compressed. Is that when Jesus first entered in Jerusalem and they were waving palm fronds at him and singing Hosanna, and he was very popular. And maybe even when he was disrupting the temple and he had also the side of the people and he was very popular, that this actually is not just a few days before Jesus was crucified, but a few months. They argue that Jesus came into Jerusalem not during Passover, but actually during the festival of Tabernacles. And that's the reason why people had palm fronds in their hands. And so he says that, like, basically they say that, like, although us modern people who aren't familiar with Jewish customs, we might not catch this, he says that palm fronds are equivalent to pumpkins on Halloween. It's not just a coincidence. Like, everyone does it. Like, you know, pumpkins happen on Halloween. So he's saying that they say that when Jesus came into Jerusalem and they were waving palm fronds and singing hosannas, he says, no, okay, so Jesus came in at the festival of Tabernacles, not right before Passover, and that really this timeline has been condensed in the Gospels, and that really we're looking at several months. And so that at first the people were very supportive of Jesus, and including maybe even this during the temple uprising, but then several months passed, and during this transition, that's when people started to turn against him. So what happened, if this is correct? One good question is, what happened in these few months? What happened that the people would turn against him like this? Maybe, I don't know this for sure, but maybe the same thing that Judas Iscariot finally got fed up with and turned against Jesus for, maybe it was the same thing that the people did too. Maybe Judas Iscariot actually is a good representation of the general people. Maybe at first they're big supporters, but then after several months in Jerusalem, they kind of lose their hope in Jesus and turn on him.
Well, right, but what would cause them to lose hope, though? Is it like claims of divinity, or what? You know, like, or that's what the Christian, like, theology would say, right?
Well, that or maybe that, or I don't know. That is one possible reason. Yes, that maybe Jesus at that time was stepping up his claims of divinity. Maybe like during this time particular, maybe there was like a big increase, and people were like, wow, you know, hey, you're taking this too far now. That could be one. I think that's one valid option for sure. Yes. Another valid option may be is that maybe in fact that he actually was, maybe Jesus originally gained followers because he was kind of had this more insurrectionist mentality, and he was going to be kind of the new king. But then all of a sudden, now that he's in Jerusalem, all of a sudden, and maybe he's making these alliances with Pilate, you know, like behind closed doors or whatever, and maybe he becomes less of an insurrectionist. And maybe that's why Judas Iscariot is like, what? We're here not to become friends with the Romans. We're here to kick them out.
Yeah, there could be, they were expecting him to be more like militaristic against Rome, and now he's starting to make alliances so that he can, and maybe making claims like, well, we'll give to Caesar what's his.
Right. Good point.
Well,
Really good
instead
point.
of,
Yeah.
people are like, well, why are you on the fence? You should be like completely militaristic about this.
That's a really good point. Yeah, maybe that thing about giving to Caesar's what is Caesar's, maybe that was kind of something that Jesus started saying a lot in Jerusalem, and people were like losing their hope in him as being some revolutionary, and to get, yeah, really good
But then
point.
that doesn't, but that would not make sense with the chief priests wanting to kill him and his brother even later. Like that, there's some weirdness to that.
There is weirdness. I think that's totally true. There is a bunch of weirdness. I think that's the one thing that we all have to admit. That's actually, the weirdness is actually what keeps me humble. It really does, because like I just can't explain everything. I don't know. I think it's really good to recognize that there's just a lot of weirdness I can't explain. But yeah, maybe that like the chief priests, for them, maybe it was something where Jesus was kind of no longer a threat to Pilate or something, but now kind of going after the priesthood. Because maybe that's the thing too. Maybe he kind of changed from being a kingly Messiah to a priestly Messiah or something. And then maybe it was just like the chief priest that now felt threatened by him and not so much the Romans.
I mean, it could be. I mean, if you really wanted to make a stretch, you could say the chief priests were aligned with someone other than Pontius Pilate, and Jesus was aligning with Pilate. And so, like with Roman authority, if you will.
That's actually a really good point, Eric. In fact, actually, I think that it is worth studying later, but there is actually some indications I've come across. I need to kind of confirm this. I don't remember for sure, but it is possible that the chief priests were like aligned with Germanicus, which at this time, during Germanicus's lifetime, he seemed like a good person to be aligned with. He seemed like he was going to be very popular. He was very popular. He was going to be the next emperor. And he did spend time in the region. He spent time in Antioch. He passed through Galilee several times. So, he was, that is possible and one thing to go back to is like, you have to look kind of like who appointed who. I think that's kind of an important question. There is some, I seem to think, and I just don't know this for sure, I have to go back and look. I seem to think that Annas, though, may have been supported by Germanicus, or like as kind of like an appointee by Germanicus originally. But that is something, though, that, I guess that doesn't, that fit, I don't think that's possible. Maybe that's too early. Then that might, yeah, so I don't know. But yeah, it's a good question, though. It's a really good question.
I mean, because the James thing would maybe make sense then, where they're like, hey, we're going to tell the Romans what you're doing, or like whatever, like Lucius, whoever, that you're doing this. And then he's like, well, wait a minute, he's doing that? Well, I got to take him out because he can't, or I don't know. There's just some weirdness to that.
It is. There is. I think that's a good response to it. It drives me, or it motivates me, and also drives me crazy at the same time. Like I can't figure it out. I still haven't put it all together. And I think we have like one last slide here that actually is this. I believe it's the last one. Yes. So here's the one question for us: did Jesus switch sides just like fellow Galilean Josephus did? So maybe Devin, do you want to read this one?
Right. Did Jesus switch? Josephus was a like.
Hey, Devin.
He initially
actually, Devin, sorry, can you start over? It was cutting a lot there. I think it might be better.
Oh, was?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Did Jesus switch sides like Josephus? Josephus was a leader in the Jewish war against Rome, but later he became allied with Rome. He initially fought against the Romans during the first Jewish-Roman wars as head of Jewish forces in Galilee, until surrendering in 67 CE to Roman forces led by Vespasian after the 6-week siege of Jotapata. Josephus became the Jewish messianic. Josephus claimed the Jewish messianic prophecies that initiated the first Jewish war. made reference to Vespasian becoming emperor of Rome. In response, Vespasian decided to keep Josephus as a slave and presumably an interpreter. After Vespasian became emperor in 69 CE, he granted Josephus his freedom, at which time Josephus assumed the emperor's family name of Flavius. So could Jesus, also from Galilee, have also done something similar? Could Jesus have started out anti-Rome, but later aligned with Rome? An idea proposed in the Lost Gospel by Jacobici and Barry Wilson. Or Jacobovici and Barry Wilson. So when I'm looking at these kind of things, I think about so what we have as far as our earliest evidence, and the problem we're always going to have with speculation is we have to make so many if-then statements. So if this passage is true, then, but the problem is we can never really know lots of that stuff. But I just kind of look at what do we have as far as the earliest accounts for Jesus. We have one from Josephus, barely, if we're going to accept that one, and we have another one that basically discusses how he was flirting with divinity in some way. We don't have, however, the kind of interpolitical games that we've been discussing today, which was common, and if it was happening, I don't know, perhaps we would see more evidence of it.
One thing that they did bring out is that in Sejanus's downfall, they basically Rome issued an order that all statues of him were torn down and his name obliterated from all public records. And so like they actually point to this as one possible reason why we don't see Sejanus's name in that alliance mentioned as much. It was very dangerous to do so.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, so thank you. That's all the slides that I had. Any other last comments?
Well, interesting idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, just very political. It would be nice to have more sources that might point to that, really.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a lot of conjecture based on like what's going on in Rome, and and you just never know what the real circumstances could be, unfortunately.
Right.
No, and the thing is, so much of it changes with new changes of the guard immediately, which is like back at the beginning when we were talking about some of the stuff with Tiberius and Capri, where it's kind of like, did it happen, right? Because you have different people who are going to come into power afterwards, like Caligula, and he's going to mess up a whole bunch of stuff that Tiberius had built too, in terms of money and funding. Basically, Tiberius had set the empire on good footing for the most part, and then all of that starts getting blown through very quickly with somebody like Caligula. Is it a way to deflect blame? Was it the fact that Romans were like that people in the state of Rome were just pissed that he left because he didn't want to deal with them, and he was just going somewhere else instead of hanging around that city anymore? There's so many things that can happen with this, and the same thing with each of these leaders. Removing their names, throwing out accusations, throwing out slander. It's all very common to kind of shore up support. The bigger things that we could kind of hold on to is that he did enough to get himself killed.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to wonder, okay, what exactly is he doing enough to get himself killed? And the same thing is happening with his brother. Yep. He did something enough to get himself killed too.
Yeah, you're right. I think that's a good, I would agree with you, Devin, that basically one of the things that's really kind of clear is that Jesus, and particularly, I have to actually, for me, it just seems that one of the clearest feuds is between like Jesus and these high priests, Annas and Caiaphas and his family. Like, I kind of find that as kind of like central to me. That's like, there's like really strong evidence for that in the both in the biblical text that we have, but also in Josephus and others as well. And so kind of where can we go from there? Yeah, it's a good way to, you summarize that well, like talking about like, a little bit, it's challenging because you got to figure out, or because we don't know what was going on in the minds of all these other leaders too at the time, for sure.
Yeah. And like, Was it political or was it more on theological grounds? It seems like is the question here.
Yeah.
Which a lot of this kind of rests.
Oh, and by the way, I guess I should say, I should maybe add that I think that although I think that it is certain, there's very strong evidence that Jesus had something against these high priests of Annas and Caiaphas family. I should actually also at the same time say that, and yet he did get himself executed Roman style. So, and that's something too that we can't, that's like also too, like, in fact, even that's probably even more certain than anything, is that whatever Jesus did, yes, he got himself killed by the Romans. The Romans at the time. That was
civil terrorism.
Yeah.
They would call that.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. And
because I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, man. Yeah, go ahead.
So the crucifying was, I'm not word on word, but it would be like we get punished by crucifixion if you disobey. If you show disobedience towards the government and manipulating the people, some sort of like that. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, and then of course the theological claims too. I do think that is something we need to take seriously as well. And what did they play in this as well?
Yeah, because they're not easy to separate.
Yeah, they're not. I agree.
Because if we're dealing with a family that has somebody making these kind of theological claims, well, that's pretty political for these Jewish priests, because it is threatening their position politically, and it also makes sense why they might want to get Romans involved too, need some extra allies in dealing with this, as opposed to the types of things I would want to know is 4 things that would be like extremely heretical that would be said. What kind of authority did Jews have to kill outside of the Roman system? That'd be one question I would want to know. Like how much evidence do we have of them carrying out executions for crimes on their own without involving Rome at all?
Right.
Because again, I mean, it wasn't too long ago before this time that they were conquered by the Romans, correct?
Yeah, the Romans
was pretty pacified, I think, by the time of Jesus. I think by that time of Jesus, it was pretty pacified. It's going to flare up again after James's execution. So I don't know if Romans are particularly afraid of a revolt or rebellion at that particular moment with Jesus.
Yeah, good questions, and I agree. Yeah, we spent a lot today talking about the political on the ground alliances and like the political perspective of stuff too. But yeah, we do at one point need to come back to talk about these theological claims as well, and what kind of impact those would have had on all this.
Hakan, you were saying something about Socrates and the Oracle?
Yeah, I was looking up for the similar text that if they copied something like from an older book like Life of Socrates or something, but I found 2 things that would somewhat look similar but not really. But I just want to add. So historiographical copying of the text, like it had a name, but I can't remember. Like for example, the 15th century medieval writer copying a part of Homeros, like that was the concept. But yeah, I was trying to talk about that, but I couldn't find really reliable things.
Are you trying to say that like the story of Jesus and Pilate was
in the temple, the part that... Sorry, I couldn't hear the last
part. Are you trying to say that Jesus and Pilate thing was a copy from the trial of Socrates?
No, not this part. The part that there was a festival at the temple and he was starting to give like teachings.
Yeah, causing a ruckus, kind of like the money changing.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And Socrates was doing that somehow too?
Yeah, that's what I was hoping to find, but not really. That No, not really. I think you should give it a try. Like, have your own opinion, but like so little, much evidence, like similarity, so little, much that I can say. That's like
there's always that thing that comes up where you have to have people are expecting to see some tropes, which always kind of clouds how these narratives are created and understood by people.
Yeah, copying narratives.
There's always this expectation that it has to play out a certain way for it to be more authentic, which is always kind of
right.
It makes it rough to get through a lot of this because so many common tropes are, and it's a problem with anything in late antiquity because there's an expectation of how these stories are supposed to go.
Right. It's a literary technique almost. You can't take it at face value.
Yeah.
Right.
Which again is always hard for us whenever we're trying to figure out what might have actually happened,
Right.
because it gets to the point of we have to do so many of the if-then statements. All right, so if this happens, then it means that there was XYZ happening possibly at the same time, but it's all quite shaky.
You know, my whole I'm really interested, Ryan, in why and how in Jesus's relationship with the Pharisees. Honestly, to me, that's the most mysterious one of all. Clearly, he wasn't very well liked by the Sadducees, at least the high priestly faction. You know, it seems to me that's pretty clear. He wasn't, you know, we could say maybe he was in a scene, but we don't, you know, that's may or may not be depending on. And then, you know, what was his deal with the Pharisees? Because that seems to be the most interesting question to me. I don't know.
Right. Well, yeah, it is a good question. And according to the Gospels, so again, you know, like everything is subject to being criticized, but according to the Gospels, he did actually have some prominent Pharisee followers. So, but on the other hand, too, he had some debates with the Pharisees as well.
But Pharisees debated all the time. That's why that's not really a big deal.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yep.
So just debating the Pharisees. What the real question is, did he accept oral tradition like the Pharisees are supposed to be doing, right? Like the thing that differentiates the Pharisees from everyone else is that they claim that they have a tradition that goes back to Moses. That's an oral tradition, right?
Yeah.
And so like they're not going to say that they're saying stuff out of their own like interpretation of the Torah. They're going to say, no, I got this from a previous rabbi who got that from a previous rabbi who got that from a prophet who got that from like
it's all an authentic interpretation. Exactly.
Right. It's all this kind of like traditional chain. Now, what the things that are more startling is when people claim that Jesus is saying this out of his own interpretation rather than, well, right. I got this from Rabbi whatever, and he told me this. And that's the difference between how the Pharisees handle the Torah versus how Jesus seems to be handling it, which is as if remember they said it's as if he's his own authority on the Torah, which would be an antithetical to Pharisaic tradition, which is no, you don't get your own authority. You get it from a previous rabbi who tells you like what the chain of like tradition is. Does that
Great point?
Sense?
Yeah.
And I think that might be an indication that he was not maybe a Pharisee, or if he was a Pharisee, that he was a renegade Pharisee that wasn't really following perfect traditions. But then at the same time, when you look at his teachings, they very much parallel the guy right before, like the rabbi right before him called Hillel. Hillel was teaching these very similar things. So you almost want to say, was he in the tradition of Hillel? I mean, maybe he was. He never was mentioned because why would Christians want to put him in a Pharisaic tradition? That would make him less of a novelty and more of just another Jew. I'm just saying, like, that's why I'm kind of interested in that.
Cool. Well, I do already have some information prepared for our next one. So our next one is going to be, it's going to run kind of, I think it'll be like the last one in the series, where the next one we're going to be looking about what was Jesus's political relationship with Herod Antipas and John the Baptizer. I'm not suggesting that Herod Antipas and John the Baptizer were necessarily aligned, but I'm saying like these three characters together also form a very interesting triangle that's worthy to talk about. So Herod Antipas was the ruler in Galilee. John the Baptizer was executed by Herod Antipas and also Herod Antipas played a role in Jesus's execution as well. So I think that'll probably be like the last one in this particular series. And
Yeah, sounds good.
yeah.
Cool.
Well, thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate just hanging out with you, talking and chatting and hearing your perspectives. I really appreciate that.
Of course.
Yeah,
I have a
thank you.
question.
Yeah, sure.
Like, so we were discussing about the tomb of Jesus at the Talmud tomb,
Yeah.
and you contacted with a scholar, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it will be hard for I know, but like, could you like make a new appointment with the scholar? Like, I don't know, like that would be great.
Yeah, you would like me to introduce you?
And not only as a meeting, like the previous meetings that these previous meetings we did the only one with the I don't know the French one. No,
Yeah.
it was French.
Yeah, she was from France. Yeah, she's the French one. Yeah, we talked with her. She basically has studied a lot on the topic of Jesus's tomb, but then more recently her focus is on Qumran and the halakha.
Yeah,
Something like that.
I'm not talking specifically about her, but like I don't know, like you could across like USA, could you like talk with a scholar? I don't know. It's just I know it's hard. Like
just to find somebody else where it's similar to. Yeah.
I don't quite understand what you want. Do you want me to introduce you so you can talk with her? Or are you saying like you want for like the meetup to have like another like kind of a video?
Meetup.
Yeah, another meetup with another scholar too.
Yes. Another meetup with another scholar. Okay, actually, I do want to do that. That actually is on my list, and I really like that idea. I would like to get more people coming in and talking. I think it was really good, the two that we had already. So I would like to get more people coming in because I like that as well. Okay, I'll work on that. Great. Okay, well, thank you very much, guys. We'll talk with you later.
Also, I have one last thing.
Yep. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So, I don't know. Was you Eric, like, or were you Darren? One of you said that. Are you talking about the comparison between Jesus' trial and Socrates' trial? Right. So I searched upon that for that, and I found some. Yeah, I found some books and one text about that. If you want to look up, I don't know. It wasn't my idea, but I just looked up after you said that, and I found some books and stuff.
I'll try to look that up too.
It certainly has similar themes. I mean, you have somebody who is, basically offering themselves up for sacrifice, not doing everything in their power to defend themselves.
The biggest difference is that the Jesus' trial is much more described with details, and Socrates is not. I just get that from 1 minute of reading. Yeah, it's all. So I guess. Yeah.
His trial is mostly. I like that. Like that writing is mostly just speeches, whereas this one, when you have the Gospels, it's more like, all rounded. Where it's like you have various meetings and different people talking. Or so trial Socrates is like, they met and then they decided that he was guilty. And then he gives some more speeches. All right, they've met and they've decided that it's going to be like it doesn't go into details of anybody else talking or any other discussions. Whereas the Gospels have a lot more of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Interesting.
Cool. Okay, guys. Well, thank you very much. We'll talk with you later.
Cool. Hey, have a good one.
Yeah.
You too. All right, bye.